on the other one, you bastard!
It's very interesting to see how third party as a whole has changed over the course of its history. These days, the Legend scene is bigger than ever, but in the long past year of 2015, the scene was vastly different. Both Iron Factory and DX9 were in their infancy, and competition from other companies was practically non-existent. However, off the backs of their success, a new company introduced a brand new aesthetic into the mix, recreating the War for Fall of Cybertron designs with a heavy emphasis on detailed paintwork. But after that, they promptly nosedived into obscurity. They released 2 figures and 2 subsequent repaints of said figures, and then unfortunately we never heard of them again. And as such, no one really talks about them these days, which is a real shame because there is some fun to be had with the figures they released. So perhaps that is why I wish to talk about these fellas today, even though it is outside the legendary Transformers Marathon, because at heart I really love cataloguing the history of third-party legends. So who cares if it ain't December yet? Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Shapeshift Inc., Skysnake, and Heavymetal. These days, with the rise of the Planet X designs, it might seem like a no-brainer to try and recreate the immensely popular Cybertron Aligned continuity designs. But back in the year of 2015, this was actually quite a risky move. Fall of Cybertron had been off the shelves for 3 years, so public consensus wasn't exactly as strong as it had once been, especially considering they'd literally just tarnished its legacy 1 year prior. We try to pretend this never happened. Even the titular Planet X was barely out the gate, having only released 1 figure throughout 2014, and over the course of the year they would only place 2 more. So right off the bat, it was a big risk, and to ensure they would be able to deliver the best products they were able to, they managed to contact well-known designer Ariel Lemon, also known in some places as Fake Busker. This guy was already well known for his 3D printed upgrade kit work, so it was a smart decision to get his help on the matter. And in vehicle mode, the design and paint work really do blend together quite well, despite certain sacrifices having to be made in order to keep the size down to a reasonable scale. Starting off with Ironhide, the design manages to capture the main points of the game model, although you can see that some liberties have been taken in order for this guy to transform properly. Ultimately though, it is a very well done vehicle mode. Now personally I don't feel that attached to the High Moon Ironhide design, at least to the extent that I feel attached to other designs in the same series. But for what it is, it's pretty neat. I mean, yes, the legs are pretty obvious, but aside from that, it's got some nice cohesion to it. There's some lovely sculpted detail that helps this from being boring. And this is the real special part, every surface is painted. Yes, that's right, every single surface is coloured through the use of extremely premium paint instead of plastic. This is actually really commendable. It's something you don't really see on that many Legends figures. Typically it's only reserved for the Masterpiece versions, and very few at that, both official and unofficial, but there have been some exceptions to that rule, and this is one of those excellent exceptions. And the best part is that there's virtually no chipping on display here, aside from a smidge on the abdomen at the bottom, which sadly gets scraped a bit as he rolls. But it's such a minor issue, and in terms of rolling, he does so exceptionally well thanks to the addition of pinned wheels. But getting back to the paint, despite every surface being painted, you do get some details picked out reasonably well. It's nothing crazy, just the bumper section done in silver and orange and the window done in gunmetal, but it does very much get the job done. If I had to complain about any colour issues, the feet hinges are pretty obvious from the top. But compared to practically every other alt mode on the market at the time, this is a massive step forward. Matter of fact, the issues overall are pretty goddamn minor, with the only one coming to mind being the back section, which, due to transformation, is left completely hollow. Whilst this is disappointing, again, you have to realise these figures came out in the infancy of the Legends scene, and the engineering that was standard at the time really didn't allow for something as complex as a rear bumper that folded into the legs. And on top of that, the materials in question don't really allow for such a thing, although that's something I'll discuss in robot mode because it's really more prevalent there, acting as this figure's Achilles heel. But anyway, Starscream on the other hand is a little messier, but in a very understandable way. Looking at the top section, which is typically the most important area of a Seeker Jet mode, it's done exceptionally well, and at the very least captures the essence of the Fall of Cybertron design. Now, it's not that close to the original, as the actual game model is far longer, trying to go for a mix of the classic jet and the G1 Tetrajet, but everything that was a key element in the game is present and accounted for. The wings are still the right shape, despite being far smaller than they should be. The nose cone section is on point, despite having to share its space with the chest details. Maybe I'm being less harsh on it than I should be thanks to my general lack of care for discrepancy and accuracy levels, since ultimately it doesn't really matter if it's a good toy, but even then, it's just a really fun jet to swoosh around. I can even forgive most of the underkibble, as this is a first attempt that is unable to build off the previous attempts of Iron Factory and DX9 because, well, it predates those. There are a couple of gripes I have with it though, like the way the feet were handled. They basically don't transform at all, and I understand given the materials it is a bit difficult, but there should have at least been some way to circumvent that and allow them to collapse. Accuracy accuracy or no, these are far too bulky and massively break up the flow of the design. There's also no real way to peg them together, and as such they rely solely on the friction of the ball joint. It is tight enough, especially due to the paint, but it just makes the design feel a lot less solid than it should be. Also, and this might be a personal thing, I really dislike the figure's stand placement. Now sure, it's nice that he actually has one, as such a thing isn't all that common on Legends figures even to this day, but even then it's just way too far forward, which massively limits your stand options. And finally, the paint is nowhere near as solid as it was with Ironhide. Whilst the quantity is easily far better, with extra red, silver and blue everywhere and the lovely pink highlights on the top thrusters, front section and null race, there's far more chipping present here than it should be. Now sure, this figure is 5 years old, so some chipping is to be expected, but maybe painting this whole thing instead of using colored plastics was a bad idea. Still, credit where credit is due, at least it's better than the limited edition version. Well, I say limited, but in actuality it's far easier to find copies of these than the original ones. Like, Jesus Christ, the paint's chipping everywhere! The plastic also feels far more rigid, so I imagine the change in type is one of the reasons that caused this. And it's a real shame because this paint scheme, which is based on the Pretender version, is actually quite nice. Not that I'm actually reviewing this guy here, we've got to keep focus on the right spot. I'm just saying, it could be worse. In fact, it has been worse. Doesn't excuse it on the main figure though. Also, on a side note, I don't actually have the black Ironhide they made. Apparently that one was a movie homage as opposed to a Diaclone one, but honestly back then I had no interest in that color scheme, the f***ing idiot that I was. Weapons wise, Starscream of course has his null rays, and it's nice that they get to remain in the same position during transformation. If you so desire though, you can position them on the stand port at the front, and if you're even crazier, you can stack them up. This is pretty bonkers, but it kinda makes sense when you realize they actually released 2 different versions of this. Well, kinda. See, I don't exactly have the transaction details of these guys anymore, but I purchased these off an eBay seller who had hundreds of them, and each figure had 2 versions, the basic and the deluxe version. The deluxe version is actually what made it to most of the market, featuring an extra rifle accessory for Starscream. Being an idiot again, I opted out of that for some stupid reason, and now the listing and the seller is gone, so ultimately I'm stuck with what I have. This is something to know when purchasing these on the aftermarket, because you may get these with or without the extra accessories. One carryover from the deluxe edition though is the fact that you can remove the top fin to access another 5mm port, and why the f*** is the fin on a split peg? These are quite frankly awful and are an antiquated third-party design choice from the days of Night Morpher, and even then Mastermind Creations had the decency to re-release the mold without that issue. Word of advice, if you're able to, avoid moving this piece at all costs, because otherwise it will eventually break down. As far as I can tell though, Ironhide only has one release version, which comes with 2 cannons. It's a bit difficult to tell if he had these in games, partly because looking up anything related to Cybertron Ironhide, whether War of or Fall of or just plain Galaxy Force Cybertron Ironhide, floods you with the results of the Siege version, and partly because the games also have interchangeable weapons. But I did find some Transformers Universe artwork that did have similar designs, so I guess they were at least somewhat inspired by something in the Aligned universe, although they are a bit weirdly designed, because you've got the machine gun element on the back section whilst the more traditional cannon one is at the front. Is it meant to be used from either angle? Because if that's the case, the 5mm peg kind of ruins that. Still, they can combine into a mega cannon and plug into the 5mm port on the top. Surprisingly, these don't look too out of place. It's not perfect, but it gets the job done. Also, quick side note, unfortunately these aren't compatible with Siege Ironhide. The 3mm pegs are far too long to allow the 5mm portions to lock in. It's entirely unrelated to the quality of the figure itself, but I figured someone might ask at some point. But in the end, these guys offer a pretty solid representation of their High Moon designs. Whilst hindsight and modern engineering could easily deliver us much better versions of these at the same size, for the time they came out they're done quite well. Size-wise, they're about the size of your average Legends figure, although these days I think Hasbro has forsaken those, so I may have to find another analogy to use in the coming future. The transformations on these guys may seem a little bit simple, but it's important to note that they are far more elegant than what was on the market at the time. Compare the transformation of something like City Commander, and yeah, there's basically no contest, especially thanks to the use of tabs. Something that might seem a little bit simple these days, but back then was a very big deal for the size class. First thing you want to do is remove the gun if you haven't already, and Ironhide's legs are sort of a pain in the ass to get out because of the tabs here, but you just kind of bring them out like so and bring out the feet, rotate the wheels down 90 degrees, and separate them like so. Come to the front bumper and open it up. You bring the arms out on these hinges like so, but then this is where things get a little bit annoying. What you want to do is actually shuffle these hinges back along like so. So it starts in that configuration and you want to get it in that configuration. Problem is that after a while, it does become a little bit difficult, and this copy, yep, this arm has completely lost its grip, so it just falls off the peg. It's able to hold a pose super easily, as well as the actual guns, but in terms of staying on there whilst you transform it, yeah, that might happen later down the line. But after bringing the arms into the right configuration, you then bring the elbows a bit forward and bring the shoulder pads down, and you're pretty much done with Ironhide. Simple on paper, but there are a few things that get in the way of it, but not too much in the end. Starscream's a little bit easier though, not because he's far less complex, because it's a bit more complex, but the tabs and everything work far better. Bring the wings up and out of the way to make things easier, untab the arms from the sides of the legs, and hinge them all the way up to get them out of the way. Then disengage the backpack. You've got this hinge on the torso and you want to bring it all the way forward, and that locks into place. Then you'll notice there's a double hinge here, and you want to orient it all the way down, not properly transformed, just so that you have access to the head to rotate it around 180 degrees. And then when that's done, you shift the double hinge back up, and you've got a peg there and a slot there at the back, and the whole thing pegs together like so. You unfortunately lose the stand port, but well, it doesn't really matter in the end. It's ultimately a Legends figure from 2015, some sacrifices had to be made. Untab the legs. If you haven't already, orient the arms properly and orient the wings properly. Fold out the wrist sections and orient the forearms properly. And last but not least, rotate the null rays 180 degrees. A very lovely touch that you're able to transform him without removing the null rays at all. I really like it when Seekers do that. And there we go, an Ironhide and a Starscream. Simple but effective. Is it ultimately fun? Yes it is. Could it have been done better? Yes, by modern standards, but for the time, I really can't stress that they are designed exceptionally well. For those who prefer to display their Legends figures in robot mode, despite the fact that Legends make far better desk toys for quick and fun play, you'll be happy to know that far fewer sacrifices have been made in terms of visual aspects for the robot modes. That only applies to the visual elements though, because from a structural standpoint, Ironhide is somewhat, dated. For the most part, they managed to nail the general aesthetic of the High Moon games, which is quite commendable given the age of the figure and the scale. The head sculpt is a little squished at the size, but it's clearly Ironhide, and it's painted exceptionally well. Matter of fact, the paint all around remains as well done as it was in vehicle mode, aside from the aforementioned belly chip that's a result of some low clearance. I could complain about the chest being a faux part, but one, I'm not George Dean from bot posting, and two, given the size of this figure, it's not really viable to have this be a legitimate vehicle mode element. Besides, as a result, he manages to clean up exceptionally well. I mean, sure, you have to deal with the hollow leg sections, in fact, it's somewhat excessively hollow even by Hasbro Legends standards, but again, I have to draw attention to the fact that this is a figure from 2015. Certain elements are wholly forgivable in this instance, such as the tabs protruding from the fists. It's little things like that that show the figure's age, but it still ends up being really fun. Now that said, there are a lot of elements that don't quite let this figure get off scot-free. For starters, these arms are a joke. I get that the shoulders are a bit difficult to do, but there has to be a better way than incorporating the entire bumper into the side. It breaks up the sculpt immensely and massive hampers posability in several ways, although the posability already has issues thanks to the kind of f***ed proportions. His forearm is basically his entire arm. His elbow is connected to his shoulder with no definition between any of them, meaning he shares more in common with Thrilling 30 Tailgate than any actual version of Ironhide. Ugh, yikes. Now to a certain extent I get the difficulty of representing this design at such a small scale, but this is where I ultimately would have foregone elements of accuracy in order to make the robot mode a bit more cohesive. I know that may seem blasphemous to some people, but honestly a well-built robot mode is better than an accurate but poorly built one. Although even then, the build quality is, not that great. It's doubtful this was the designer's fault, but for whatever reason they've chosen a really awful plastic. It's really flexible and doesn't feel that solid at all, although when I first purchased these many a year ago they were even more flexible. This means that over time the figure is slowly becoming more and more brittle. Longevity in plastic is an incredibly important thing, and I'm not sure they were taking that into account with these two. I doubt these two will practically crumble into dust eventually, but definitely be careful with these going down the line if you do purchase them. Finally, and this is more of a nitpick than anything, the handling of the wheels seems a little bit segmented. They don't really feel like they're properly part of the design. I get the necessity for having them in such a configuration, since that is game accurate, but I feel that some alternative tooling would have helped. Maybe they would have seemed less annoying if the thighs were shorter, but given the length of the vehicle mode, that doesn't really seem like an option. So yes, Ironhide does have a lot of flaws, but ultimately I do find this design quite fun. Matter of fact, I'd say he's easily one of the better Legends Ironhides on the market at the moment. Well, is he technically on the market? It's been a long time since his release, so it may be hard to find the original. He's far from perfect, but some leeway has to be given considering this figure is 5 years old. And at the end of the day, he is fun. No such leeway needs to be given to Starscream's robot mode though. Jesus Christ, this fella is a looker. The sculpt work is immaculate, perfectly capturing the design from the games, and the paintwork doubles down, really capturing your gaze. Like, bloody hell, there's a lot of paint here. Once again, every surface is painted, but the fact that the silver is more on show makes him feel far more premium than Ironhide. The best part is that the chipping is massively reduced. Sure, the thighs are a bit weak around the edges, but for the most part it's incredibly durable in this particular mode, probably because the wings are mostly hidden behind him. That's because these shoulders are actually quite wide to facilitate the transformation, but honestly in person that wideness doesn't make him look that bad. Despite this hypothetical proportional dissonance, he actually ends up looking incredibly cohesive thanks to some expertly done sculpt work. I only wish they'd added added more gold paint, maybe to the shoulders, not because this thing lacks paint, but because the paint is done so fucking well that I want more! Even the backpack remains 100% clean, with virtually no kibble whatsoever. Even the hollowness on the legs is massively reduced, and actually ends up looking like ventilation sections, so kudos, I guess. If I had to pick two things to complain about, it would be in relation to the plastic and the head. For the former, I've already discussed it at length with Ironhide, so it isn't worth going over again. And in terms of the latter, I don't really know how they could have done it otherwise. You ultimately have to disassemble the backpack to access the head articulation, and as annoying as it is, at this scale, what else could they have done? The fact they're able to pull off this design at all is an incredible feat of engineering, and let's be real here, it could have been a lot worse. Not gonna lie, I really don't like these things. Their engineering is clunky as hell, whereas it's simple but effective with the Shapeshift Inc. version. I mean, sure, I don't think it holds a candle to the New Age version that graced our collections this very year, but that's 5 years down the line. At the very least, I reckon it's on par with the Iron Factory version, which debuted in 2017, 2 years later. And considering that figure came from an already established company, and this was a complete newcomer, I have to give credit where it is due. Weapons-wise, the null rays look about as good as null rays should on a Starscream. Maybe they're a smidge long, but at this tiny scale, there isn't really much to complain about. And for those curious, which is probably just me to be honest, they are indeed War for Cybertron blast effects compatible, but they do stretch the plastic just a smidge, so I wouldn't recommend it. Ironhide's weapons, though, aren't as well thought out. When held normally, they're mostly okay, but in their forearm configuration, they're just way too far out of the way. It's clear that this was the intent for these weapon holes, as in vehicle mode, those storage ports are kind of goofy. But honestly, the execution ain't the best regardless. It's not the ports though, it's the weapons themselves. Still, they can hold the larger War for Cybertron blast effects if you're careful, but the ports are incredibly loose. Fortunately, as far as joint tolerances go, nothing is loose. Thanks to the careful balance of paint, everything remains incredibly tight, but not to the point where the plastic is practically destroying itself. Ironhide has a ball joint to the neck, but it can look a little bit weird from certain angles due to the cavity it resides in. His shoulders have hinges and ball joints due to transformation, but as mentioned earlier, the shoulder pads make posing them a pain in the ass. Thankfully, the ball jointed elbows work without issue, and they easily hold up the rather heavy cannons, which is something Transformers can have issues with. Gotta say, for a ball joint to work this well, it's quite commendable. The waist surprisingly has a dedicated swivel, not used in the transformation, and he has ball jointed hips that go all the way forwards and backwards. Unfortunately, they don't go outwards that far. However, if you want to get a full outward kick, you can cheat the system by utilizing the ball jointed knees. It's not perfect, but it does work. Said knees can also bend all the way due to transformation, but unfortunately you don't get any foot pose ability aside from the slightly backwards that could potentially complement that, before it gets lost in the ankle anyway. Starscream's a little simpler, but works far better. The head, as mentioned earlier, is on a recessed ball joint that requires you to disassemble the backpack. On said backpack, the wings move backwards, which allow you to utilize the shoulder hinges present from the transformation. His shoulders and elbows are ball jointed, and you can move the wrist inwards if you desire, although if you go too far it ends up looking unnatural. Thankfully, the ball jointed hips have no issue moving in any direction this time, and the knees also work perfectly, although they only get 90 degrees in any given direction. Finally, the feet are on ball joints as well, which allows for some really sturdy poses. It's clear that both the company and the designer took into account the fact that every surface was going to be painted, and as such this is one of the few Legends figures I've come across where the tolerances are practically perfect. Side note, if you want an example of what they could have done wrong, look no further than the limited edition version. Yes, thanks to them using inferior paint, not only is the chipping far worse, but many of his joints are loosey-goosey. It's a real shame. I adore this Pretender slash Slipstream slash G2 Ramjet color palette, but it's clear this was a rush job, and honestly, whilst I highly recommend the base set, I'd be lying if I should say you should try and hunt down the other version. Size-wise, these guys may seem like they're different sizes, but they're actually quite close, both only slightly getting a height advantage over most Hasbro Legends. As such, anyone who's obsessed with scale will probably find it easy to figure out a spot for these two in their collection, except that would be the case if this line had been continued. As much as I enjoy Heavymetal and Skysnake, ultimately this story doesn't have the best of endings. It's a story as old as the third-party niche itself. A company starts out, releases a few figure, and then fades into obscurity for any number of reasons. We will never know what truly happened to Shapeshift Inc., but if I had to take a guess, I would find it highly unlikely there wasn't a demand for them. Considering the vast success that Planet X had had in the years following Shapeshift Inc.'s departure, not to mention the sheer scarcity of any of these two on the aftermarket, it's hard to believe nobody was interested in a full line of War for full of Cybertron Legends figures. If IDW, an even more obscure property, can pave the way for Legends as a niche, then who's to say High Moon Designs couldn't carve out a fanbase of their own? There is another common hypothesis that seems more likely. The company simply didn't have the resources after completing this project. This is evidenced by the limited run that followed it, which featured much cheaper plastic, weaker paints that was applied thinner, and a much higher cost, which could have been a last-ditch effort to save the company. I mean, to be fair, it's not the worst way to go at. They could have tried to scam the entire community with a crowdfund and ran off with the money. Oh, right, it's time for the obligatory F**k Mars Toys portion of the video. But indeed, part of me does wish this company went on to do bigger and better things, especially considering the G1 dominance on the current state of the niche. Sure, Iron Factory is succeeding in switching from IDW to mostly original designs, but it would have been nice to see some more variety these days. Well, what was, and what is. And in the end, all we can really discuss is what we got, and what we got is still really fun. Ironhide may have its flaws, especially in the robot mode, but at the end of the day, he is still an incredibly fun figure, and does rise above the other Legends versions. Well, aside from maybe the New Age version, but I still think is a worthy addition to the collection. And Starscream, well, he has very few flaws, and I think you should get him no matter what. Surprisingly, after 5 years, he still remains one of the best Legends seekers on the market, and at the very least is better than the Magic Square version. Ugh. I don't know if he borrowed his transformation scheme from the deluxe version because I don't own it, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but regardless, he is an incredibly fun figure that deserves a spot in your collection, whether you already have a Starscream or not. So aside from trying to draw awareness to them in this review, all I can really do is offer my condolences for the company. So, at the end of the day, rest in peace, Shapeshift Inc., and may you remain forever known within this fandom.